someone last Tuesday, or like 2 Tuesdays ago mentioned that you had off. Did you guys get a chance to like pick through at least some of the robot videos that I put up about like doing the rig? Sweet. So that's basically, I actually have like, I realized like 1 or 2 more little things that I want to add up or do videos on, but that's pretty much, you're just going to like follow along with those videos to rig your robot, and that should be due next week. So this is, again, I put a link to some rigging videos. There's some extra ones. There's the ones that I made, and then there's also like 1 or 2 other ones that sort of explain like why you do some other things, linked in this Google Doc here. And then the basic requirements for the rig is that you should have at least the basic IK-FK switch with your rig. So I did 2 versions of that. Again, if I'll sort of go over some of the differences between those again today, and I'm glad to answer questions on any of that. But there's one version that's like fairly straightforward to set up. You just need like 1 joint chain, and then there's like a fancy version, which will be extra credit, involving attaching 3 joints for each limb together. So again, I'll go over that a little bit sort of later. You should have controllers for all of your joints or like all major body parts. So like if I put clavicles on my robot, so like I would have to actually have joints to control those clavicles if you have them. If you don't, like don't worry about it. But everything should be a controller. You shouldn't need to go in and like manually click on any of your like IK handles or joints to access anything in your rig when you're actually animating it. And then I'm also going to look for, is the outliner organized and named appropriately? Those of you guys who like saw me doing rigging, you see it got like real gross real fast. And I do need to look at these, so I would like everything to be named. Yes? Yeah, so I mean, you can do textures pretty much whatever you want. The textures are one of those sort of assignments where it doesn't really impact your animating, so I actually have that due like at the very end of the quarter. So pretty much just like work on it, whenever you want. Functionally, I was more concerned about you guys having a model so that you can rig the model, and having a functional rig so that you could start animating your project. Any other questions? Cool. And there is a video specifically going over how to organize the outliner so that your models, or like if you need to rotate or scale your model, it doesn't explode. So I would like that to be followed. I will be sort of testing rotation and scaling your models and seeing if I can deliberately break your rigs. Sometimes I write things and I was like, why did I type that? All right. So additional notes, basically like the assignment pretty much is just do the rig. This one I'm grading a little bit strangely, in the sense that you sort of start off with, I think, like 10 points, and if things are broken, I will sort of like deduct points from that, if that makes sense. So I have like all of this stuff, like specific list of things that like I'm looking for and functionality that I'll be testing. So here we have like some stuff for the generic rig. This is again, if your outliner is like set up kind of weird and I can't scale your robot without like the skin ripping off or like the legs exploding, that'll be a 2-point deduction from the rig. Having crazy rotation values in all your joints. I'm only going to check like this if it causes some kind of issue with your rig. I'm not going to like click on every joint manually, but it is something I will look at again if I see a problem with your rig. And basically I just have like a bunch of different stuff that like going down you should have implemented. So like here we have like the basic IK-FK switch. You need this for all of your limbs. So if you have 2 arms and 2 legs, you would need to do like 4 of these. If you don't include this, it's a 1-point deduction. Kind of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's like a lot of random things I wrote in here. I did try if there was relevant things where I like mentioned how to do the foot control kind of thing. I like linked to the YouTube video going over that, so that you guys can just sort of like have that as a reference if you need it. So this is, again, one of those weird assignments where like negative points are possible if your rig is super broken, but most of the stuff on here is fairly straightforward, like put controllers on all of your joints. Like if you do that and nothing's horribly broken, you're probably fine. And you can always go ahead and resubmit for like to get any of those points back that you lost, which I would recommend anyway, because most of the things on this list are things that will actually cause you issues when animating. So, you know, if you're getting points taken off, it's also for something. It's probably also going to make your life harder animating. And next week is probably going to be mostly open lab. So, because like usually when people rig for the first time, it kind of explodes. So I want to make sure that like I can, after you've like actually done something more substantial with the rig, I can like sit down with you guys and like help you troubleshoot in person if you guys need to do stuff before you start animating. So that's pretty much how this is graded. This is a very, very long list of like things I'm looking at. But does that make sense? Cool. There is also, again, some opportunities for like random bonus points, adding like the quote-unquote nice IKFK switch, and just like random other things. I did this weird little thing of like, if you want to pose your robot with your rig, do some little dynamic poses, you can get some extra points for that. Again, just sort of like testing your rig, making sure nothing's exploding with more like real-world situations. And then in terms of what to submit, the only thing that I like hardcore require is a Maya file with your rig in it. If you could just like note which controllers, if you've added like any extra like twist controllers or like your IKFK switch, just throw a note about like where that is on your rig so I know where to look for stuff. And if you've added any like extra fancy stuff for your rig, like, oh, I've made, you know, a bunch of wires that can be controlled, or like I have some weird thing on the eye that I want you to look at, throw that in as well so I know what to look for so I can give you the most points possible. And the little poses, if you got them, feel free to not zip them. I think there's only like 3 of them, so you can just chuck them up as like JPEGs or whatever. But that's pretty much the rig. Any questions on that? Okay. If you guys are having issues with your rig throughout the week, feel free to email me, because yeah, rigging for the first time is always kind of weird. All right, so apart from the rig, we have the cut reference that is due. So hopefully the sort of storyboard feedback was helpful to you guys. Maybe you have like an idea of anything you would want to change, but basically for this, I should probably find the what is this? Did I link to the wrong Google Doc? That's awkward. What is this? Hang on. Okay, weird. Haha. Messing up things. Oh, okay, cool, sorry. All right, so this is basically going to be sort of taking your storyboard and shooting your own reference footage from it, and this is what is it's going to serve 2 purposes. 1, you're going to actually use it to animate with, and 2, you can use it as sort of like the last hurrah for getting a chance to proof your story in terms of testing out your camera angles a little bit, and seeing like with all the like actual moving pieces with limbs, if your story still comes across the way you want it to, if there's still anything you might want to change. So basically, again, this is a group assignment. So presumably you guys will be getting together and like shooting this yourself. You're welcome to use either, you can act as your own actors, or you can like find random innocents that you know and force them to be your reference people. It kind of doesn't matter. But basically what you should do is shoot reference for every clip that you would be putting in your final, and cut it together so it's essentially your final animation with you guys acting it out, or whoever you've chosen to act it out. If you want, you can do orthographic reference, or you can match the camera angle. So if you have someone who's like angrily yelling, you can run around and be like, ah, like this or something. You can, you know, either shoot an orthographic, so like straight forward and straight from the side as they're like yelling and emoting, or you can say, this is shot from like a really tiny robot's perspective, so I'm gonna like put a camera down here and angle it up at my face, so I'm just sort of like yelling into the camera like I would be in the final clip. Does that make sense? Cool. So that's completely up to you guys which one you want to do. I do recommend, if you're gonna shoot orthographic reference, maybe if you have like a really weird like complex walk cycle or something like that, it might be helpful to have both of those camera angles in there. Otherwise, usually I'll just sort of match the camera angle and call it a day. This I forgot to change, so I'm going to go back and change this. So here's basically just some, make a note of that. Again, I'll just change this so it's not a requirement, but if you are doing orthographic shots, here are the requirements for it. You must use at least 2 camera angles for each portion of the reference. So again, I recommend like a front and back camera and like a side camera. And this is really important. If you guys are going to use orthographic cameras, find 2 cameras, cell phones are acceptable, and shoot the clip at the same time. So what you don't want to do is like take your cell phone, like put it in front of you, do your thing, and then take your cell phone, put it here for their side reference, and then do your thing again, because it's never going to sync up. You need the 2 cameras there at the same time. It's like, yeah, just, does that make sense? It's like a weird, if you do orthographic reference, I will be a stickler about that if your stuff like super doesn't sync up. Okay. Okay. And yeah, so this is basically just random stuff. All right. And then, like I said, cut it together. So pretty much you should trim off, if you have like a bunch of lead time where you're sort of like, okay, the camera started and you take like 2 seconds before you start moving, you want to cut all of that stuff out, cut this together again as if it is the final timing for your project. Also, make sure that your cameras aren't handheld. It just makes everything a little bit harder to look at, especially for orthographic reference. And just like a little thing, if you could tag each piece of reference, so with whoever's going to animate it. So if there's like, basically for each clip, just like put the name of the person who's animating it in like the top corner. That can totally change if you guys want to change it. It's just sort of like me to get an idea of who's doing what in the animation so that we can sort of like have a better idea of what's going on going forward. But yeah, so I have some just like weird suggestions for easier assembly. If you're doing orthographic references, I recommend going through and for each one that you're doing, cut them together in its own file and just export it as like a little synced video. And that way you can just sort of cut it without worrying about like syncing up the videos while you're trying to like also worry about timing and stuff for your other frames. And just sort of like other random things. I do recommend avoiding excessively dark or like white clothing while you are shooting your reference, purely because it is really hard to physically or like visually see what's happening, especially with black, because you get like no exposure, so you could be having a lot of like movement in your elbow that like you wouldn't be able to tell what's happening. So I would recommend either wearing tight fit clothing or something at least not like a super baggy sweatshirt or something like that. Or if you don't want to do that, you can grab some little pieces of tape, like colored tape, and just sort of tack them on your body in key points, like along your elbows or along your hips. So that way you can kind of tell what's happening, even if you can't see whatever, because you're wearing like black clothes or something like that. Missed other additional notes. Huzzah. And then I have a bunch of just sort of random example reference. I think, so we can take a look at these. I think these are actually like pretty good examples of sort of like what you'd be shooting for and like how they would translate into your final animation. But basically, point breakdown is 4 points of this is the reference quality. So can you see what's happening? Do the clips sync together well? Is, you know, for the person in the frame, like if you need to have like a full body walk cycle and you can only see like the person's torso, like that's gonna be a problem. And then cut quality is just like, does the timing feel reasonable for the story? And is the animation burden divided up well? So that was like, kind of ties into the like tag everything with who's doing what. Because again, if you have one person doing 30 seconds of walking and one person doing 30 seconds of like a guy sitting on the couch eating chips, like that's, you should kind of like divide it up so everyone has a chance to like, you know, do some practicing with the walk cycles, that kind of thing. What to submit? All you need is a compressed video of your cut reference. And for the record, when I say compressed, I do mean with media encoder or similar, not just like taking a giant file and putting it in a zip file. I'm fairly certain I've had people do that before, which is why I put that note in. So this is pretty much literally just a compressed video. Any questions on that assignment? All right. So we'll take a quick look at this. And feel free to not include a title scene.
I'm on a mission from above.
Are you the baby Jesus?
Yes, I'm the baby Jesus. No! You see, I'm more middle management for the company.
The company? What company?
Here. Take this. It'll explain everything.
What do you want me to do with that?
I want you to suck it.
You suck it.
No, it's for you to suck.
Ugh, I'm not sucking that.
Suck it.
I don't know where it's been. They're gone.
I failed.
I would have gotten to my parents if I didn't have to go back for you.
What? We would have been here in plenty of time if you knew how to ride a bike like a normal kid. We're never gonna stop the launch on time.
Who cares? My parents are in danger.
I care. Baby Corps is going to go out of business.
Ugh, that's all you ever talk about. You don't even know what it's like to be part of a family.
And you don't know what it's like to have a job.
You don't know anything about hugs or bedtime stories or special songs.
Oh, please. Stop acting like a baby.
You're a baby.
You take that back.
My life was perfect until you showed up.
Oh, believe me, kid, the feeling is mutual. I wish I'd never met you.
I wish you'd never been born. Where are you going? Fine.
But yeah. So I have a few more of them, and they're all like pretty funny linked here. I would recommend checking them out. If for no other reason than, again, they're really funny. But I mean, that's pretty much what you'd be looking to do with your shots. One thing I kind of don't care, like there was one scene where it was like panning downwards. If you guys can't get that shot or whatever for some reason, like that's fine. You know, if you can't like replicate that panning motion, that's fine. You just sort of splice things together, but that's pretty much what I'm looking for in terms of your finals. The other thing to note with that one, if you guys have crazy differences in the scale of your robot, you'll notice that they actually like scaled their reference. And when they were shooting the animation, so like if they were looking up at the older kid, they were shooting sort of from the baby's perspective, like looking up at him, and vice versa for the baby. So the baby was always sort of looking up, and if they had them both in the shot together, they actually scaled their reference. So the baby animator guy was like tiny and short. So that's another thing that you guys can kind of do to like help gauge how things are going to be working in your scene. And also don't forget, like when you guys are actually animating, don't feel like you have to stick entirely 100% to your to the reference that you shot. It is there to sort of like as a tool to help you sort of figure out basically what body motion looks like and like how physics works. So you don't need to think about that, and you can really focus on like pushing the animation, like pushing exaggeration to really make the animation pop as much as possible. All right, any questions on the cut together reference? All right, so let's see here. The other thing is the list of who does what. This does not need to be a super crazy long thing. It is literally just a list of basically sort of planning what exactly you need to accomplish and who is doing those things. So you should have some kind of shot list and like who's going to animate each scene. And again, you can just like sort of write that out. You can do a list of like environmental assets, who makes them, who textures them, whatever. It doesn't need to be the same person for all of them. So like if one person's like really obsessed with modeling, they can model everything and the other person can texture it all. Like that's totally fine. It really is just sort of like dividing up the work in whatever way you guys feels reasonable to you and fair, and whatever way you think would sort of like play to everyone's skill sets as best as possible. Other thing is like more or less a proposed timeline of when you'd like to get everything done. So maybe this could be as specific as like by week 7 we're going to have all of these environmental assets done, and like making a specific list for each week, or just saying sort of like by week 8 we'd like to have all of the robots textured and like the models for the rooms done. So I'd recommend just like sort of using a Google Doc or like some random similar thing that you can all just edit at once. You can refer to it, see things, tweak things if you need to, without like sending copies of Word docs back together. And I'm not, so for this, I am totally not grading this. This is mostly a tool for you guys, so I'm not grading this on like who says they're gonna do the most stuff. I just want you to have some kind of like cohesive plan of what you're doing and everyone to be on the same page, since pretty much like week 6 on out, you guys are going to be doing more like actual production work on this as a team. And again, how you format this is totally up to you. I kind of recommend tables or calendars, but like really whatever makes sense. This is also the thing that I'm going to use if for some reason people come back and they're like, you know, so-and-so like didn't do what they were supposed to do for their project, and like we feel that this is like unfair, like they didn't do anything or something like that. This is the doc I'm going to reference for like what they were supposed to do and what was actually done. So that's the other sort of like secondary purpose of this is for me to look at if you guys like have issues with your team. This is another one of those like weird little assignments where it's just sort of like you need to do it, and if you don't do it, you'll just sort of like get negative points for it, but it's not like worth anything on its own. In terms of what to submit, again, just sort of like a Google Drive doc or like a PDF or like whatever, kind of submit whatever makes sense for however you formatted this. Again, links to Google Docs or whatever, totally fine. That's pretty much that. Any questions on this?
I have a question about the previous thing.
Yes, it's all good.
So it says you need the 2 camera angles for each one. So is the reference then going to be like 2 side-by-side things?
So the, oh god, I do actually have an awful, so I do, okay. I'm rambling, sorry. I'm gonna tweak the wording of this, so I'm not requiring orthographics or from camera angles. This is sort of meant to be like, if you do orthographics, here are the requirements. If you do camera angles, this is what that is. I do have an example of orthographic, okay. This is, judge me if you want, but this is what I want for orthographic cameras. Like this is what I would expecting, but sync together. I hate this assignment, the animation's terrible. But you'll notice that like you can see what's happening because I'm wearing light colored clothes and it's like relatively tight fitting, so I can actually see like what my arms are doing. So again, if you do orthographic reference, this is what I'm looking for. You can see everything syncs, like whenever my feet touch the ground, it happens at the same time on both frames. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sweet. And then the other one, since I have these all here, this would be an example of like, I have absolutely no idea what the heck I'm doing because I was wearing like a really dark tank top. So I put tape on my hips so that I could see how my hips were moving. And this would just be pretty much like, you can see that like whatever angle I have in this terrible reference I shot is the same, pretty much the same camera angle I ended up using for the animation. But yeah, so that's more or less like what I would be expecting sort of for each reference. Make sense? Sweet. Any other questions about that or any of the other assignments? Alrighty then. Cool. Since we are only 27 minutes into class, I am just going to jump through and again, anyone have interest in looking at their models before we pop into some rigging stuff? Okay. So I do have, if you guys are interested in following along, I have under the, where is it? Oops. Sorry, under student resources in the Google Drive, sample models, Maya files, I do have this like robot caricature rig thing, which I will be using to demo stuff in class. It's also like pretty much the complete rig from those weird videos that I made. So if you guys want to like play with that and see how it works or like look through anything in it, this is there for you guys to peruse. But basically today I just want to go through some of the sort of rig things just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And I'll show you 1 or 2 more things about like smooth binding because I didn't talk about that in the videos, as well as a really, really goofy way to rig cables, which is a little bit convoluted, but gives you a decent amount of control for that. And again, can you guys all see with the windows open? Sweet. I'm not gonna lie, I do find it much nicer. Like, again, I'll totally close the blinds if you guys need. There's like something much happier feeling about not being in like a little dark hole in Urban. All right, so I'm just gonna grab this rig and like throw it in here. Tra-la-la. Huzzah. So we have a rig. It's ugly. I spent like way too much time on this. I was like, I'm just gonna do a simple project for fun for like demo, and then I'm like, why? I went like way hamsies on this. So you'll notice that I did, since last time, set up this weird little experimental sort of control for the, what am I saying? The little curves on the back, or like the cables. So I can sort of have additional control of these if I need to animate them. And this is actually not using smooth binding. This is like a wire deformer, but again, I'll sort of show you different ways to do stuff for that. Before we get into that, does anybody want to tell me or like take a stab at the difference between like an IK and an FK setup? Or does anyone know what IK or FK stands for?
I don't know what it stands for, but I know.
Cool. Shoot.
Oh, wait, I'm pretty sure the FK is like, they're all separate, so it's like this, like, if I move this, this will move, and then the IK is, if I move this, then the rest of it will come with it. And so, like, do this then.
Yeah. I mean, that pretty much is the difference. So basically the difference between IK and FK is, and I actually, so like, I kind of forgot that this was a thing. I like watched a video and I was like, oh my God, for some reason like this makes so much sense when it's explained like this. So FK stands for forward kinematics. Basically, I'm imagining this is like a really trashy looking little arm, but basically like if this is the shoulder, when you move it, everything sort of farther away or like down the chain is going to move with that shoulder. So it moves basically in the order you created the joint. So if you create like the shoulder, then the elbow, then the wrist, the shoulder is going to move the elbow, which is going to move the wrist. Or you can kind of also think of it as like working from, usually it'll be like the core outward. So like, again, like the shoulder, your arms and your hands are going to be farther away from like the center of your body or your chest than your shoulder. So they're going to be animated last. IK stands for inverse kinematics, which is basically, hey, do the opposite of an FK setup. So instead of moving the stuff closer to your core first, we're going to move like the hand or the things farther from your core first. And again, that's just accomplished with a little, with the IK handle. So instead of rotating the individual joints basically, you can just grab this handle, which is basically attached to like this theoretical wrist, and just sort of move that around, and it will play with the rest of your skeleton and like do some automatic calculations for that. Basically, again, FK, forward kinematics, is core out, and inverse kinematics, IK, is outside in. And that's kind of like how I think about that difference, actually. And for some reason, like when I was thinking about it like that, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense when I was looking at like the little single chain solver in the foot. So can I actually, I'm curious, can I get a hands up? Did anybody actually watch all 10 of those videos? I know there was like a lot of stuff.
I watched the first 9.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I figured it would probably make sense to do videos so that you guys can like go back and refer to things if you need to in like maybe a more organized fashion than just sort of like, here is a recording of the class. But yeah, so if you guys didn't watch all of them, totally cool. So I'm just going to sort of go through a few things that might be sort of helpful to you guys to keep in mind while you're looking at things. If you guys need to stop me to ask questions, again, totally feel free. And I'll probably run around at the end of class and do some open lab where you guys can actually like start doing rigs. But let's see here. So those of you that watched the video on the IK handles, you'll probably, I did go over some of the different ways that you can sort of modify them, but there's two basic types. Let me really quick open my outliner. All right, so we have this little IK handle here, and you'll notice that we have this like weird little sort of like white pointy thing. I don't really know a super great way to describe that, but it's like this little white triangle sort of pointing in a direction. And what this basically is like the rotation plane or the pole vector of this IK handle. It basically tells it, hey, which way is this bend supposed to be going? So if you basically, like if I grab this little thing and I move it, you can see that it sort of bends along this, this plane here. As we move this around, you can kind of see that, it's a little bit hard to see actually. We can kind of see that like this is reorienting itself and pointing always in the direction of that elbow. So that's one of the ways that you can control an IK handle, is actually by controlling this pull vector. Kind of behaves, is anyone not familiar with an aim constraint and what that does? Okay. I'm going to take that as you guys are all good with aim constraints. But basically what this is doing is sort of like pointing in the direction of this default bend of the skeleton. And you can actually add additional things and constrain this so it always points at that like additional thing that you've added, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to throw in a little sphere, and I'm just going to snap that onto that joint and sort of point it back here. So we have this silly little question mark. Okay, that was weird. So I'm just going to go ahead and like freeze transformations on this. So again, there's two different ways that you can control the bend of an IK skeleton. This one is basically controlling the pull vector, or like controlling the direction that that goofy little white triangle sort of points to. So if I grab the control, or like this little circle that I've added, which I'm basically is just going to function as a control for now, and then I grab my IK handle, and you go to constrain and pull vector. There's not a whole lot of options here. It's pretty much like, do you want the constraint turned on or not? So I'm just going to go ahead and apply that. And you'll notice that it's basically drawn a line almost from between this like little sort of start of your IK handle and this like little white triangle to your little sphere. And if I move this around, you can see that the arm is always going to point at that sphere. So you can like drag it to the other side of the body if you want. And if I go ahead and I move my arm around, you can see that no matter what I do, it's always trying to point at this sphere. Like the elbow basically is always pointing at this sphere. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is, again, just like pull vectors. Basically, you just need a thing for your object to point at. You can use, a piece of geometry like you did here. You could use a curve, or you can make like a little locator. I don't know. I kind of hate locators. They drive me nuts. But like locators basically is this weird little thing. They don't render. They just sort of serve as like a placeholder. You can snap like joints or whatever to them. They literally are just there to like say, hey, I need a thing here, and it doesn't need to be like a piece of geometry. So I use the locator in the video. I prefer just using curves. I think it's easier to deal with. But this is basically pull vector. The other thing that you can do, which is honestly usually what I do, and now I'm kind of like, maybe I'll make pull vectors because I've been having issues with doing this, is, let me just chuck another IK handle on this. So the other thing you can do is controlling this through the twist value in your IK handle. So if you select your IK handle, you notice there's this little twist value, and again, if I just like scrub through this, you can see it controls the rotation of basically like where the elbow is pointing. So in fancy advanced rigs, you can actually have both setups on your rig. I'm not going to go over how to do that. I'm just going to say kind of like pick one for now. You can also decide like, I kind of want to try both. So like one arm is going to be pull vector and one's going to be twist. Again, it doesn't super matter. I have noticed that sometimes if you're doing like really, really strange range of motions with your body, like going to be pushing it to things that are like not super natural like positions, which I had to do for some weird technical animation I was doing for a guy. Every once in a while when you're doing twists, when you're controlling an IK with the twist value, it'll sort of cause the spine to like, or like cause the joint to like flip out and rotate really crazily. And like, I'll probably not be able to just like replicate that randomly. But pull vectors, I was like, oh, that could actually be potentially a way to fix that, because it doesn't care what the rotation of the arm is. It's just always trying to point at this thing. So as long as this, controller thing is behind the elbow or whatever, theoretically you should always be good, question mark. But again, usually I just sort of use the twist value, so I've never tested that in practice, but potentially a thing to consider. So that's pretty much the, again, difference between IK and FK, and two different ways that you're going to want to control your IK positioning or like twist of that elbow or knee joint. Any questions on that so far? right. For the sake of argument, does anybody remember how to make custom attributes on controllers? Cool. Anyone want to tell me how? Or no? Was that head shaking? Okay. So this is going to be just sort of like generally necessary for your rig. I'm just going to, what is all of this? Why is this here? This is driving me nuts. Okay. Great. All right, so basically if you want to make an extra attribute on something, so say you have like, what did I do? Okay, so like this, the IK foot control has a crap ton of extra random attributes that I've added. So this is basically, is this set up as FK right now? I don't know. May have forgotten to hook that up. Hang on. Okay, I forgot how my rig worked. So you'll notice, like, again, I have like all of these like weird attributes set up for like the heels. I have stuff for like the ball of the foot, so you can, do nice stepping and stuff. And like, obviously these are not default things that come with your rig. I do go over how to do this foot setup. It's the last video in the series, and half of it is just me sort of like trying to troubleshoot weird stuff, so I do apologize. It's like a little bit of an awkward video. But basically, if you want to add any controllers like this or extra attributes, you just select your controller, go into your channel box, and do Edit, Add Attribute. You name it something. And usually, if you're making an attribute, presumably you would want it keyable. The only other things that I really play with in this are the, the data type, and the minimum and maximum values, and very occasionally the default. So data types, if you guys have ever done any kind of coding, this is pretty much exactly like when you say a float or an integer or an enum, it's the exact same thing it means as coding. So anyone want to take a stab at the difference between like a float and an integer? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so anytime you want, or you think you might want, a value of like 2.73 or like 59.2 or whatever, you should use a float. Integer you only want to use as like, I only need 0 or 1 or 2 or 3. So a lot of times I'll use integers for like Boolean values, so it's either on or it's off. For something like the IK switches that I have the videos on, you want to use a float because basically what you can do is like scrub really nicely between like the bones are following the FK setup, and they'll interpolate very smoothly to your IK setup if you can get those decimal values. Again, I kind of go over that like more specifically in the video itself. Anyone want to take a stab at what a Boolean is? Yep. Yeah. So Boolean, functionally the only difference between a Boolean and an integer, I'll actually show you, I guess, the difference for grins. They do exactly, or they can do exactly the same thing. I think integers are just nicer to deal with because I can just control numerical values instead of like having to type in on or off into the switch. It's just like a personal ease of use thing. I usually don't use Booleans. String is just like a string of text if you, for some reason, need that. I've never actually found a use for that, but it's there if you need it. And an enum would just be, I mean, you actually, preview some names here, but it's basically like you can select between a list of things. So, again, I've not found like a super crazy use for this, but like if you for some reason needed to select between like a preset list of colors or maybe like a preset list of functionalities, you could do that with an enum. So I'm just going to go ahead and do float. Minimum and maximum values are just, do you want to lock these in place? So if you put nothing in, you can enter whatever value in that you want for these numbers. If I put the minimum as 0, I couldn't enter a negative number. Same thing with maximum. And then default is just what do you want it to start at. So if for some reason you wanted it to start at a value of like 50, you would just enter 50 in here, or you could just keep it at 0 and change it later. Kind of doesn't matter. But I'm going to go ahead and just like add that value. So we have something float. And then I'll say something int, do an integer. And this is like usually if I'm going to make a switch with an integer, I do it with the minimum of 0 and a maximum of 1. I just think it makes things straightforward. Go ahead and add that. And then Boolean, let's see if it, great. And you get no options for that. We're just gonna go ahead, okay. I didn't honestly expect it to let me add a frowny face in there, but I figured I could try. So you can see, like, if I have a float value, I can do, and this was, again, no minimum and maximum, I can pretty much just scrub through this and do whatever the heck I want with it. The something integer, if I, and again, this is capped at 0 and 1 for the minimum and maximum. If I try to enter like a 0.5, it's just like, no, you get 0. If I try to answer, type in 3, it's like, nope, you get 1. So again, usually I'll just sort of use this for like, it's off or it's on, off, on. And that's mostly what I use ints for. Booleans, again, you'll notice that like, it says the word off, and if you need to change it, you gotta go in and type on. And I'm like, that's just a pain. Like, what? I don't want to type, like, I can just take this and toggle it. I don't want to, like, click on buttons. You could also, if you wanted to, use an enum and just say, like, on, I think this is, like, a less gross way to do things. Blah. Great. So at least with an enum, you can sort of, like, click it, and it'll just give you a drop-down, and you can just be, like, off, on. I don't need to, like, touch my keyboard to type things. So that's effectively the different types of like values you can add. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Cool. If you, for some reason, need to edit values or like edit these or delete them or whatever, you can totally do that. So like Boolean, I'm just going to get rid of this because it's evil. So I'm just going to right click and do delete selected. Nope. What is that? Ah. Hang on. Oh, my bad. Sorry. All right, so if you want to like delete this, just do edit and delete attributes, and that should delete whatever you have selected. That's also not going to work on any of these default Maya values, so don't try to delete those. If you need to edit it, say maybe I want like on, off, or like idling or something, you can do edit attribute. It's going to ask which one do you want to edit. I'll say whatever I've typed in here is going to try to sound it out. And then you can, if you need to like type in other enum values like value. And you can see now if you click on this, it has that extra value in there. So you can go through and sort of like modify your values, or if you're like, oops, I maybe shouldn't have capped that at 1, I can just say has no maximum or like modify that however you need it later. So don't feel like if you mess something up, there's no way to go back and change it because there totally is. Any questions on adding attributes? Editing? Yep.
So the minimum and maximum is like if you want to stop it from going, like, is it like, for example, if I had that, maybe, can you do like on an island?
Yeah.
So you could say like only go up to here, only go down to here.
Right. Yeah, so like islands would be a good example. If I'm doing an island and I had all these fancy plans to make like fancy islands for my character, and then I was like, but like, so usually, then this is again, however you want to set things up is totally cool. But if I had like an eyelid and say, I might cap the open because like I wouldn't want it to open past the top of the eye because it's horrifying. If it's me personally, I'll kind of like leave the whatever value to like control where it is on the eye itself, so that I can have the maximum amount of expression possible. Like I can move those really freely. And I'm sort of the mind where like, I would never, for like a human rig, you have like nice like openy, closey eyes. I never really made keys or like set positions of like the eye is closed now. Because if you think of, and this is like really weird, if you ever, I'm not gonna like ask you guys all to like close your eyes and roll your head around right now, but like if you ever do that and you close your eyes, it's like natural, I feel like, for your eyes to sort of like continue pointing in a direction, and your eyelids are gonna sort of follow that. So if you're like bending your head back, your eyelids are probably gonna be pointed maybe like more forward or more up. So I think having to like key that manually, A, it takes half a second, and B, I think it kind of makes things a little bit more organic feeling. So that's just like kind of my weird tangent on eyelids. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely good as like a limiter so you don't like, rip your rig in half or something like that. A lot of times people will use limits for I'm sorry, why are these not on my joints? Hiss. The problems you find. But a lot of times people will use them for fingers, so like you couldn't do something like, deselect. You know, I couldn't like clip the fingers through the arm or something like that. So you might like put a cap so that you physically can't bend this past apparently like 113 degrees, or something like that. Any other questions? All right, cool. So like I said, I think that was pretty much, okay. I think that's mostly like the sort of conceptual rig stuff. So I did want to show you guys, and I'll probably do another video on this, but just like how to do smooth binding on like a piece of skin. So in this case, I'm actually doing something kind of different and weird with the cables. This is actually not smooth binding. So for grins, I'm gonna show you guys how to just like model a really quick, hideous finger and rig said really quick, hideous finger. Because I feel like that's actually gonna be something that's like kind of relevant in shape to what you guys are doing. So I'm actually just gonna start with a cube, because I'll start with a cylinder. All right, so I'm just gonna build this back here because I can. Also, if you guys never knew this, if you press and hold J while you rotate, it'll snap it to like 15-degree increments. You can see how it's snapping. It's pretty convenient for getting just like 90 degrees without having to type in 90 degrees. So usually if you're going for like a low poly something, I'll usually start with like maybe eight little segments going around. It's enough to define like a smooth curve. And if you need to smooth it, it also holds its shape fairly well in terms of like the actual curvature of that finger. All right, so all I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna assume this is totally not gonna be at all proportional to what a finger looks like. But I am just going to basically do Control E and just extrude this out. So again, and this holds if you're doing smooth binding and you need like a tight crease. The same principle, remember from like CGI 1 and 2, where it's like, if you need a sharp corner, you need 3 edge loops. That still holds true for this and organic modeling. So anywhere that I have like a joint in my finger, or if this is like an elbow or a knee, same thing here, I'm going to put three little loops just sort of next to each other. And then for the tip of the finger, I'm just going to sort of do this really horrendous looking nub. Like I said, it's a very ugly finger. But basically what's going to happen is like these faces here are going to function as like the bend in the finger. So if I were to move the pivot down here, I'm just going to smooth this, looks like a weird sausage, and rotate that, you can see that it kind of like keeps that bend. And obviously this is like not an ideal way to do this, but because of those edge loops, you are able to sort of like define that bend more clearly. And you won't end up with like noodle fingers. So for something like cables, like I have on the back of the character, it's probably better to have like a more even distribution of loops. But if you are doing something where you do need this sort of sharp bend, you can do this with the 3 loops. All right, so let's see how. I'm going to, for grins, just to make this slightly more fingery, just grab these little bottom loops here and just push them up slightly. That'll give you a tiny bit of sad definition in like the top of the finger. And perhaps to make some more respectable something that resembles knuckles, maybe, I'll do something like this, and it kind of maybe looks more fingery. My dumb hack for fingernails, I always ask about people doing fingers. This is sort of like why I'm demoing this, but my silly hack for fingernails is just sort of like grab these upper faces, extrude them, and you're gonna push it straight down and straight back. So it kind of like is actually pushing in like under the skin on the finger, and then extrude again, go straight up and straight forward. So when you smooth it, you do get that kind of weird, awkward fingernail kind of shape or something. And if you feel particularly aggressive, you can make it spiky. So we have a finger. It's beautiful. To rig this and to do the soft binding on it, what we're going to do is just come in and add joints pretty much the same way like we've been doing before. Those come in, skeleton, create joints. Usually this will be attached to some kind of hand. So I'm just going to like put a sort of hand joint here. I'll come in and I'll put a joint. If you're doing sort of realistic fingers, usually you'll put the joints sort of, if there's like a knuckle here, center it sort of in the little clusters of 3 loops you've made. And I like to put the joints, that was maybe a little bit too high, but like kind of high up on the finger. And do another one here. And I usually actually don't put one at the tip of the finger. You can if you want. It ends up just kind of being useless. And I realized like when I was animating for games, I was like, you don't use this. It's just an extra joint that you have to process in Engine. So I'm just like, why am I even putting this here? So I'm just sort of, this is usually where I'll leave it for a finger rig. And this was, again, in a horrible position. It's kind of like way too high. So I'm going to move it down. And I think I mentioned this in the videos. If I didn't, you'll notice like if I grab this and move it, it's dragging this joint with it. And that one I was actually happy with. So I'm just going to undo that. Press and hold D as in dog. And it's going to let you move that joint individually. And again, this one just sort of stays where it is. So basically, the thought process behind actually making this finger rig, there's sort of 2 different ways that you can set this up. And I'm just going to do X-ray joints. And I'm going to duplicate this insane little finger. Actually, I'll duplicate this up here. So there's sort of 2 different ways you can bind this together. So first one, I'm just going to grab the whole finger, grab the whole skeleton, and go to Skin, Bind Skin. I will open the options. And again, there's 2 settings that I want to show you guys. So one is bind to joint hierarchy, which is going to be any joint attached to the one you selected. So in this case, I selected this like fake hand joint. Because I've selected joint hierarchy, it's also going to attach this finger to the 3 joints that are parented under this one that I selected. Selected joints I'll show you next. This is good for doing stuff like, you know, hard robot bits, or anything you don't need to have like a really smooth bend in it. The rest of this I sort of just usually leave as is. If something looks particularly weird, I might like fiddle with the settings, but I honestly don't really worry about this much anymore. And then this is purely personal preference. Max influences is the number of joints that can control a particular vertex. So basically the way smooth binding works is it's going to look at each vertex on the skeleton and say, okay, 20% of the vertex's movement is going to be controlled by this joint, and the other 40, or that's not how math works, the other 80% is going to be controlled by this one. So max influence is like the number of joints that can affect a particular vertice. I usually like setting this to 3. I just find 5 to be like really unwieldy and hard to work with. Again, it doesn't matter at all. It's whatever your personal preference is. The other thing I usually do is turn off maintain max influences. So again, this is how many joints control a particular vert. And if it's set to 3 and this is turned on, it's going to forcibly keep 3 joints controlling a vertice at all time, which isn't necessarily what I want. Like in the case of this fingertip, it hopefully when you bend, you know, your wrist or whatever, it's not going to like move the tip of your finger. So I want like this to only be controlled by this last joint. And sometimes with max influences turned on, it kind of gets weird. So a lot of times, again, I'll just sort of turn that off. Apart from that, this is just sort of like other things I usually ignore. It's just sort of like how Maya calculates how to do your skinning. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply. Again, any questions so far? All right. So we have our joints. If we go ahead and bend this, you see we get something. Very disturbing and like thoroughly not ideal for this. So that's where going in and doing a little bit of painting skin weights is going to be helpful for setting this up. Really quick before I do that, I just want to show you guys, so like if I did, selected this joint here and I did bind to selected joints, what that is going to do is if I select this and move it, it does nothing. If I do this, it only moves the finger because this joint is controlling this one. So basically the entire skin is just attached to this one joint. So again, not great for stuff like wiggly cables or anything like that, but definitely good, again, for like, pieces of your robot. That's how I bound the entire skin. I just set bind to selected, and I just went through, clicked the skeleton, clicked the skin, and then just did bind, and just did that for all 50 whatever pieces in this robot. So it can be a little tedious, but it does have its uses. Any questions on the difference between those? Go. Let's see. All right, if you ever need to detach a skin, what you can do is go to, just click on your mesh, do skin, unbind skin, and it's going to break that connection with the mesh. So if I rotate this now, nothing happens. Every once in a while, if you do that, it for some reason goes through and it like locks all of these. Like you'll notice this skin, it's gone through and it's locked all the attributes because it's being controlled by the joints. You shouldn't be touching these at this point. Sometimes if you unbind a skin, it will leave them locked, and if it does, you can tell. I mean, you can tell by the like little blue line that was there. You just want to right-click on them and do unlock selected, and then you'll be able to actually modify your skin. Again, I don't really know why it does that, but sometimes it just sort of does, and it can cause issues. Like if you're ever trying to freeze transformation with your the attributes locked, it's going to yell at you and not let you do it. But I'm just going to go through really quick and do bind to joint hierarchy again, hit apply. So this should be pretty much the same thing that we have as the finger up here. So what I'm going to do is show you two different ways to control how terrible this skinning looks on your character. So really quick, I'm just going to set some terrible keyframes, and you should totally never key on joints. I'm just doing this for demonstration purposes so I don't need to manually move them. But basically, like, I think we can all agree that like this is a really ugly finger and it shouldn't squish down like this. So again, there's ways to fix that. Oh, these are all just labeled joint, aren't they? Gross. Indecision. All right. So again, two ways to handle this. So the one that most people usually use is like if you click on your skin, right click and do paint skin weights tool. It'll pop up this little menu here. So what it's going to show you is essentially all of the joints that are attached to that mesh, and it's going to colorize your mesh based on the influence of a particular joint. So like right now, joint 18, which is, whoops, don't tell me I broke Maya. Really? This is, save often, guys. Cough. Okay, I'm gonna, dang it. Now I'm salty. All right. Kill Maya, restart Maya. I do highly recommend, while you're doing this, while I'm waiting for this to restart, I highly, highly recommend saving your rig versions often and in multiple iterations because stuff breaks all the time. While I was making my rig, Maya crashed on me like 7 times. I was doing weird stuff with it, but it's still irritating, and you guys should totally save your stuff. All right. Salt. Give me like 2 seconds to recreate the sad finger, and then we will proceed with doing things. Dang it. All right, and I am not going to add the fingernail or anything because, like, you get the point. This will work. Beautiful. It's ooh, I forgot to. All right. I may or may not have forgotten to set the number of verts to 8. It doesn't really matter. It's just kind of going to be more annoying to look at. All right. Rigging skeleton. Create joints. All right, so we have joint, joint. That's not how I set that up. Joint, 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 joint. Cool. Hooray. Okay. So again, I'm just going to go through and bind both of these skins with joint hierarchy, minimum, then turn this off. Okay, cool. Goes much faster the 8th time you do everything. Cool. All right. So we should, theoretically, be good. Ha 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 ha, yes. The thing where the joints at the end of the chain behave super weirdly. All right, so we have some reasonable facsimile of what we had before. And hopefully, let me just save this in case Maya blows up. Finger. So different ways to bind skin, or to control how your skins look when they're bound. Again, the first is the Paint Skin Weights tool. And that is, again, just right-click on your model, Paint Skin Weights. It's going to show you all the different joints that are attached here. And there's a few things I like to do by default. Again, this one is completely personal preference. I think it's easier, like the black and white is pretty hard to look at for me, so I use the Use Color Ramp option. And it's basically just going to show you a little bit more of a descriptive what's happening with the colors on your rig, or like what's happening with the weights. So values of blue are like very, very low weight. Black is no weight for a particular joint. And then if you get like red or white, that's like super a lot of weight, or like white is totally like only being controlled by that one joint. Again, I just think it's a lot easier to look at than like this. You can't even see that there's influence here, but as soon as you turn this on, it's like really obvious that there is. So totally personal preference. But basically what you're just going to want to do is go through, you can click on your different joints, and again, sort of see what the influence looks like on those joints, and like how that's sort of distributed and broken up. So if you actually want to change these, in this case, this is joint 5, or like the weird hand joint. What I'm going to do is actually just sort of get rid of all the weight on that. I'm going to say, in this instance, this is not connected to a hand. It looks weird for it to deform with this. So what you can do, there's like different sort of options that are actually kind of similar to Photoshop, honestly. I usually just use Replace and Smooth. So Smooth will go through and just sort of like, if you draw on it, it'll just sort of like, it almost behaves like the smudge tool in Photoshop, where it'll just sort of like blend the values together and like make them less extreme. So it's a really good way to maybe, if you have something that's like a sort of like hard edge in your weight, so you can kind of like hit it with the smooth tool. In this case, I want to replace it and just get rid of all of the influence here. So what I'm going to do, come over to Replace. Opacity functions totally the same way as in Photoshop. Value is basically a percentage of influence from a particular joint. So a value of 1 is like 100% influence, 0 is no influence, and you can choose whatever number in between. So in this case, I'm just going to go through and come in and try to paint out the influence here. You can notice that like as I draw on this, it's taking the influence from like yellow or red, which is like a fairly high influence, down to blue. But what I want is for this to be black, and you'll notice like right now that's not really possible. The only way in the Paint Skin Weights tool to achieve full black or full white is to use a brush without fall off and the Replace brush. At that point you can draw on it and it'll just obliterate everything. But again, having that little bit of blue is still having influence there. Most of the time, honestly, it probably won't make a huge difference in things, but like I just like having clean values, so like I'm just gonna get rid of that entirely. That make sense? Cool. The other thing, while I have these particular brush settings, so like if we look at, these should have sort of the same deformations. You'll notice that didn't do a huge difference. It is maybe holding its shape a little bit better in this area. The other thing I'm going to do is come through in joint 4. So you'll notice that like right now, this is actually controlling back almost to like the first joint in the finger. And the influence here is pretty soft. So like if we look at joint 3, I mean joint 3 is just kind of like insanely controlling everything. So that was, that's the joint for this second little finger phalange here. And like that's affecting the tip of the finger, which I don't need. So what I can do is just paint that influence out entirely, or I can just go into joint 4 and set my value to 1, and I'll just be like, boom, the tip of the finger is only following the joint for the tip of the finger, and that's just like what I'm gonna leave that as. So from there, you can kind of go through and continue refining. So I'm gonna say like the tip of the finger, maybe, maybe doesn't need to affect like this back joint, or this joint here. Same thing for joint 3. Actually, that might actually be pretty not terrible. Okay, so I mean, you'll notice it's definitely different than this one, especially like the tip of the finger holds its volume a lot better. This is pretty weird in here, and that's something where you might want to just sort of go through and again, just like Maybe I'll try the smooth tool and just sort of like hit this area a little bit and see if that does much of a difference. But basically, this is how you use the paint skin weights tool. You just sort of like tweak it. You can see that's like a little bit less creepy looking. But just kind of go in and like tweak values until you're happy with how your joints deform, which like that's clearly wrong. So honestly, this is like probably more in depth than you guys will need for your robots. I didn't notice anyone's design doing anything like that. I do want to show you, so like, again, that's pretty much the paint skin weights tool. If you need to change your brush radius, that's down here. If you're, depending on the scale you're working at. Anybody have any questions about this? Okay. So I do want to show you guys really quick, one other way that you can edit. Seriously? Maya sucks, man. I don't even, but at least I saved the dumb finger docs. You don't need to make me model a finger for the 4th time. But there is one other way that I want to show you to modify weights on a character. Save, find the file, yay. I will say this is much better than it used to be when I started in Maya 2013. All right. So again, one other way that I think is easier if you're doing stuff like specific creases, like I'll use this pretty much all the time for fingers and elbows and stuff like that. If you select the vertices on your model, so like I'll just start with the back. Actually, I'll start with the whole thing, what the heck. Go to Windows, General Editors, and Component Editor. And if you open this up a little bit and go down to Smooth Skins, you'll see it's just like this weird chart of all of the vertices you've selected and all of the joints that influence them. So you can manually change these values, say, at the tip of the finger. It'll just give you all of these vertices, and you can literally just say, I only want values of 1 for joint 4. So like they should only follow that last joint in the finger. So basically it does exactly the same thing as what we did up here with the paint skin weights tool, where we like painted the value to white. You just don't need to actually use the paint skin weights tool. But the thing that I find is really convenient for this, so like I can really easily just knock off like I don't want that little fake hand joint to have any weight, so I'll just be like 0, and now that doesn't control any part of the finger. What it also allows me to do is go in very, very easily and say for each of these sort of middle curve in the bend of your finger. I don't really know how to say that better. I can be like, okay, this doesn't need any influence from like this fingertip, so I'm just gonna put that to 0. What I can do is just very, very systematically set everything to values of like 0.5. And then I can do that for this one, and again, like I don't need the weight from the tip of the finger. And this one I would like, so joint 2, joint 3, I would like this one to mostly follow joint 3, so I'm gonna say maybe like a value of 0.8 here. It automatically sets joint 2 to 0.2. So you can kind of just go in and like really, really, really systematically get nice, very specifically controllable creases in the finger. And you'll notice that like, if I do this, like this is, I don't know, I mean this is, if it's personally, I just really enjoy this kind of crease in a finger, or like elbows, where it's just like that really nice sort of hard crease. If you look at it, you can see, and it's pretty aggressive actually, but like, you can see it just does a really nice job of sort of stretching the verts with the curve of the joints. So again, we can do that down here and like, what? Okay. It's gonna be one of those days, I see. Yeah. You gotta love Maya, guys. Sometimes I also wonder, like, what is actually happening there to cause the, because it is a finger with 4 joints in it, for pity's sake. Like, it's not that complex. All right. So, really quick, I just want to show you the bend in the other finger. So again, just pop open the component editor, Smooth Skins. This one I'll get rid of the values for 0.2. Because it does, I don't know, it just makes really, really satisfying bends. But again, you can sort of, either way is completely viable in how you want to do your painting of skin weights. I just find like for fingers, this happens to be like way faster for me personally than doing than using the actual paint skin weights tool. It's also just like hard to physically get into the little areas around the fingers. So hopefully, okay. Oh, it actually saved. That's great. But yeah, so I mean, you can see like we have these nice sort of like pudgy finger bends, and the finger sort of holds the volume much better than whatever the heck I've done up here. So that's more or less like the paint skin weights tool. If you guys, does that make sense? Like, you guys have any questions on that? Cool. The only other thing, and this is going to be like a super quick demo because honestly I'm terrified Maya's going to blow up if I do anything more, is if you guys are doing something like cables, maybe start with something kind of like, I think 20 is just excessive for subdivisions. So what you'd probably do for a cable is basically just start with something like this to create joints, and just throw a few joints in there. It would be better if these were straighter. I'm just going to kind of leave these as is for now. And just go ahead and bind that skin like you would normally. For the love of goodness, save my settings. And once you do that, you can just sort of go through, select all of these, and you should, okay. Yeah, you should be able to just sort of like rotate those and get like a relatively smooth bend in your, you know, whatever gooey thing you're animating. The only thing to be aware of is like you'll notice maybe in a few areas, like kind of right here, it becomes a little bit of a sharper corner. So there's basically, this is only going to work to make a really smooth curve if I had like another joint in here that I could sort of bend to control this inner area. Otherwise, it just sort of assumes that it's something maybe like an elbow where it's like, you know, you have long spans between joints. So it's not a bad idea as you're laying your joints down to go in and sort of fiddle with them a little bit and just like bend them around, make sure that before you get like super far into the rigging process that like I have enough joints everywhere I need them to make smooth curves, that kind of thing. You can also go in if you want to and like work on maybe painting, like you try hitting this with a smooth tool. That does help a little bit to make it a little bit rounder. So again, sort of like different ways to accomplish this. But this is actually a lot of times where I use the smooth tool. It is really good for sort of like evening out these values if you're trying to make like a smooth cable bend or something like that. That's pretty much smooth skin binding. I think like that should be enough to get you guys through what you need to do. Anyone have any questions on that before I pop into a weird thing of rigging a cable? Okay. So I think actually pretty much the only thing I do actually have to go over with you is rigging this cable. Do you guys want to do a quick break and then do that, or just do it and then have like a quick break in Open Lab? Sweet. Rip the Band-Aid off. All right. So I have some cables set up. If Maya will deign to let me open my file and keep it open for more than 3 minutes, this is basically the sort of unholy combination of deformers, rigging, and like soft binding. You can actually soft bind curves. So if I turn off, I'll just turn off the skin geometry and I guess the skeleton. So again, we can see like we have our body, and as I move this, it's basically controlling the, we have control of this curve because of these extra little joints that I've added. And these can be, I've like added a little mini rig on them so I can sort of go through if I need to and be like, oh, I want, you know, this to twist more, or like in this case, this bend looks terribly appalling, so I'm gonna sort of bend that back into some other position that looks slightly more appalling. But this should give you enough. It might be like a little bit awkward to animate, but it's going to give you all of the control you need to make sure that your cables or whatever you're animating are like smooth and able to be modified so they're not like clipping through the body or doing anything crazy. I was actually fiddling with some kind of weird, more experimental thing. Really? I see how it is. Experimental thing yesterday with like sort of procedurally doing the middle part. You can see theoretically that like this, there's no real like rig on this. The middle of the curve is just sort of like controlling itself automatically. Can you guys actually see the curves on the screen? Okay. But it kind of controls itself automatically, but I was having issues getting the skin bound to it, so I'll show you the little rig for now. If I figure out how to fix that, I'll put a video up. Oh god, why is this keyframed? No. Okay, whatever. So basically what you're going to want to do, if we look at... oh my god, this is being so laggy. Okay. What the heck? Be a little sad if I have to restart this computer. All right. So I have my horrendous rig set up. If you guys have ever, actually looked into this, basically all these cables is geometry around a curve. So what I did, and I actually have a video of me modeling this. I'll just do like a really goofy, quick demo, I guess, on it. I'm apparently a fan of goofy, quick demos. But basically, if you guys didn't know that this was like a thing that you could do, you can actually extrude chunks of geometry along a curve, which is kind of cool. So this is actually how I made the cable chain, in case anyone was curious. I'm just going to do modeling, mesh, combine. So I'll just, it's still like two separate objects, basically. And then if I go ahead and I just make some kind of like CV curve tool, haha, it's glorious and wiggly. So if I wanted to like extrude that weird shape that I just made along this curve, what I would want to do is like move it kind of close to the beginning of the curve and select the object and then grab all the faces in that object. For some reason, if you just select the object, it doesn't work. It must be all the faces. Then shift select your curve and just do extrude like you normally would. You'll notice this looks appalling. You just need to go in and like add a few more divisions into this, and you'll notice that like as soon as you do that, it starts actually following your curve. The other thing that you can do with this is you can go in and add some twist values to this. So like that's how I got the twist in the cables. 400. So it's just like an interesting way to sort of extrude weird shapes. You might need to like reverse that. But you can see we do have this like very strange extruded cable. So conceivably this would actually be a pretty decent way if you were ever trying to make like weirdly organic like ice cream or something like that. You could like draw the swirl with a curve and then like extrude it out. But that's just like how I made those cables. I do have other tutorials about that online if you guys ever want to reference that. You can also use that with a combination of MASH to make some really weird stuff like barbed wire and other fun things. But anywho, that's essentially what I did for this is again, so we have this curve and the piece of skin, which I just hid somewhere like a dingus. Tra-la-la, left. All right, so we'll do the arm. Basically what we want to do for this is, I'm just going to turn off all my zip ties. It's going to go into the upper view of this, and I'm going to hide pretty much everything except actually I'm going to hide the geometry of the cable as well. I'm just going to turn off my grid. So essentially we need a few things for this. So if we're looking at this on the arm, we have, let's see, sorry. Hi y'all. All right, so we have basically like a few places where this is effectively tied down to the arm, so that shouldn't move, right? Like if you put something under a zip tie, presumably it's not like flopping around there. And a few places where it's like attached into these weird little hubs or like power things that I've added onto the character. So we need a few things for this to work. It's basically the same setup that I've created for the back. It's just, we're gonna recreate that setup a few times for this longer cable. So the first thing we wanna do is basically select, or like place joints to hold down the areas we don't want moving. So like the places attached to these hubs, anywhere that's been zip tied to the body, and again, like this hub down here. One thing we can do to help with that is, if you select the curve, just go to display, where is it? display NURBS and CVs, and that'll just show you where all of your little CV points are. This way we can really, really easily go through and just like snap joints to all of those vertices. So what we're gonna do is go once again into our rigging menu, do skeleton, create joints, and I'm just gonna press and hold V, and it should vert snap those directly to these CVs here. Once we have that, we hit enter. So this is actually made up of like a crap ton of a bunch of different little joint chains, and they're all sort of attached. Hello. They're all sort of attached together with controls. So again, this will be a bunch of like weird separate pieces of this. But basically what this is going to be is that anchor to prevent the cable from clipping through that little geometry hub. So we'll go ahead and throw one of these little joints on the other side of this body, just pressing and holding V to vert snap it to these little CVs here. Make sense so far? Cool. It occurs to me I probably should have put some more CVs there. Anyway, and we need to do the same thing basically for the area around the little zip ties. So for this, I'm just gonna place a joint, and I'm gonna do the same thing again. So I'm just gonna hit G and put a joint basically on the side, connecting the joint into this existing one, and vert snap out to here, and do the same thing again over here. So start here, just go to the next CV out, and add a joint in here, and another one here. So basically we have these like weird little nubs that are just gonna kind of like hold everything in place. If you look at this with the skin, I've done isolate select, I see. You can kind of see that it's like pretty much, again, wherever there's a zip tie is like one of these little controller joints. So that's the basis of what's going to hold the cables in place wherever we need them stationary. What we also need are something to control the other points in this curve. So like this dude here, this dude if we need things to like flop around a little bit. So those are going to be extra joint chains that we add in. So start with this one. You can actually lay your curve out. I kind of wish I did this, but whatever. But you can lay your curve out so you have points like exactly where you need them. In this case, I'm just going to say the heck with it. I'm just going to control this with a single weird floating joint right here. And then for this one, I might actually do kind of the same-ish thing. I'm going to, yeah, what the heck. I'm just going to tack a joint on to this little CV and tack another one on here. So basically this whole thing is just being controlled by random floating CVs. Oh, I've missed, yes, good. No, I haven't. What is this? Interesting. Oh, okay. Weird. I'm going to turn off these controls. Cool. So again, I'm just going to kind of go in and like lay all this stuff down. So basically what we have is a curve, and there is a joint on every single one of the CVs in this curve. And what we're going to do now is actually go ahead and bind the curve itself to the joints. So does anyone, before we do that, any questions on the setup we have so far? Okay. So what I'm going to do is just go down, and I've not organized any of this because I am a terrible, terrible person. I'm just going to select all of these joints because they are, so this one, it is different joint chains, so we should probably be selecting like the specific joints themselves. It'll just make our lives like a little bit easier. And then select the curve and go to skin, bind skin. So for this one, again, anyone want to take a stab at what I would want to use if I would do joint hierarchy or selected joints for this? Okay. So you would use, in this case, I would use selected joints just because it's like a little bit easier. I've literally gone through and selected all of the ones that I need, and it just seems like a straightforward option. For max influences, I'm going to do something a little bit different and actually set this to 1, which is basically going to say, effectively, since I have one joint on every CV or like every modifiable point on this curve, it's going to attach that CV only to that one joint. So if I apply this, if I take this joint, you can see that it's just like moving that one little CV of the curve. If I grab this one, it's going to drag sort of these other points with it. But this is going to be sort of the foundation for actually moving the wire. So that's basically that setup. Let me really quick save in case this explodes. Yeah, 12. Ugh, saved a binary file, whatever. All right. So the next thing that we need to do is just like pretty much make a crap ton of controls so that we actually are able to move this abomination of a rig around. And this is, again, my personal preference. I'm just going to go through, and we're actually not really going to do much with this last joint in the chain. It's literally just there to hold the cable in place and not be moved. That's its purpose in life. So I'm just going to snap this control to out here and then shift the pivot back. You'll notice that if we move this joint, it doesn't actually affect anything. What we actually want is like this joint. Like this is pretty much a placeholder just to be attached to that CV. To actually control this, we need to move the other joint in the back. So that's how I'm going to sort of position my curve. Like visually, it seems like it should be controlling this, but it's pivoting from here, if that makes sense. The other thing you can do, and again, this is totally optional. I just think it is easier to look at. If you go into the shape node, in your attribute editor for this curve, object display, and drawing overrides, you can actually change the color of this curve. So I've decided on the sort of like weird color coding for this, where basically any control that is going to be sort of like a stationary point or like one of these places attached to like something solid, I'm just going to turn it red so it's like very obviously visual of what is happening. And I'm just going to go down and basically copy and paste this onto the rest of the joints in this cable. And I'll start again with all my little red joints just because I think that's a little bit easier to figure out what exactly I'm selecting. So we have these guys set up. If we look in our perspective view, I don't know, they're not super gorgeous, but like they do what we need. The next thing we need is actually more controls to control all of these insane floating joints I've put everywhere like a crazy person. So for this, what we're going to do is just make another curve, drag it up, and I'm just going to leave these blue because I'm feeling kind of lazy. So again, we'll do the exact same thing, just like snap that onto all of the different floating verts that we've made, and I'm not going to go through and like label all of these while you guys are here because that's cruel and unusual punishment. But basically, this is our weird little rig setup that we have so far. If I wanted to, I could like rotate these, but like, eh. So I'm going to go through. Anyone from like the first like 2 videos remember what you should always do before you actually start hooking controllers up to things? What you should do to them? Hint, 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 hint. Okay. I definitely say this in the videos, but anytime you are going to use controllers, you always want to go ahead and zero out their translation, rotation, and scale. Because that way, if you ever need to snap your controllers back to where they were originally, you can do that very, very easily just by zeroing everything out, and you don't need to like guess where things are. It's actually one of the reasons you don't want to animate on joints, because if you animate on joints, and you like move them by accident, you translate them, there is no way to get them back into their original position unless you've like manually copied all of the translation values and are able to somehow re-enter them back in, which nobody does because that's insane. All right. Any questions on this setup so far? All right. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is start hooking up these controllers to the joints. So I'll grab the controller, grab the joint, do constrain, and anyone want to take a stab at what kind of constraint I want? Okay. I'm going to use a parent constraint because in this case I want, if the hand moves, I want this controller to like go with it and take the skeleton with it. So I want that for like translate and rotate. So I'm just going to go ahead, turn maintain offset, just make sure everything's selected and hit apply. So that way, if I move this, you can see that the controller is now taking the joints along for the ride and the curve with it. So I'll do pretty much the exact same thing for the rest of these. I'm just going to go through and parent constrain all of these systematically. It was tiny. Ah. Cool. Half of rigging is literally just systematically parenting things to each other, and it's very blah. But again, so now we have this very easily editable curve. We can move this around if we need to. And if we've done something really, really strange to it, we can go through and just like zero that out and put it back in the position that it was at before. So at this point, probably would make sense to maybe start connecting this into the actual skeleton itself. So this is, you can do this in like a few different ways. Some people will actually go through and like physically attach this joint into the hand just by like parenting it under it. That way if you take the hand, theoretically it would take it, the controller's affecting that. I think that's kind of gross. I don't know. Again, there's like 4 different ways to do this. I just like having my bind skeleton, or like the skeleton that skins or like the body pieces are attached to. I like having that separate without a lot of extra stuff on it. So what I'm going to do is attach this in with constraints. And to do that, I am going to basically do some weird sort of fancy-ish grouping. I'm going to grab this NURB circle, group it, and do modify center pivot, and just snap that pivot, because again, we want it to rotate down here. And basically what this is it's going to be a group that I can mess with and constrain to the hand. So for those of you that watch the videos, I show you how to make like hand controls follow along with the hands. They don't like fall off randomly. We're going to do the exact same thing. And basically, wherever this wrist goes, I want, so like this is attached to this little hub thing, I want that to always follow the hand and the cable with it. So grab your wrist, grab this new little group you've made, and do another parent constraint. So what that should do is if I move this wrist, you can see that it's taking that cable with it. It's taking the cable and the control, and it still allows me, that extra group still allows me to come in and manually modify this thing if I need to mess with it. Had I directly constrained this control, which I will demonstrate up here, up here, this is attached to the chest. So if I grab the chest and then just grab the control directly and do a parent constraint, you'll notice that, so as I move the chest, it is going to take the controller, which is totally what we want. What's less ideal is that I now, okay. Sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. So half the time when I do this, it doesn't let me move the controller. And then sometimes it'll like let me move the controller, but then it'll like behave very oddly. Because it's still trying to like I'm modifying it and the chest is modifying it, and it like doesn't know what to do, so it'll sort of like snap back and forth. So of course every time I try to like demo something breaking, it doesn't, but it's still good practice, again, I think, to just put that extra group in, grab your chest, grab the group for that controller, and just go ahead and do another parent constraint. So I'll do that for sort of all of these little bits of the body. I'll just take the control, add a group to it, and then attach the joint that it should be following. So what we should have here, like if I move this around, you can see that like these little joints here are just sort of like chilling, following along with the rest of the arm. But these controllers are not so much doing that. So we need a way to hook those up to the body. What the actual heck is this? Interesting. That's very strange. Okay, hang on. It seems like I've just added an extra random joint down here, and I don't know where that came from. So, anywho, all right, cool. All right. Anyway, that was weird. So what we want to do is basically some more sort of like grouping and constraints to attach these to the arm. So you'll notice like, so for this one, we only constrained this control to this joint here. So if we move the hand, that control, this little control for the wire follows the hand completely. So this one, we don't necessarily want that. Like, it would be kind of nice if it maybe interpolated a little bit between the elbow and the wrist. So what we can do is actually set up a constraint with both of those controls in it. So what we're going to do is, again, take this little control, throw it in a group, and then instead of just selecting the wrist, we're going to select the wrist and also the shoulder, and then we are going to select that group that we've made for this little control here and do like a 40th parent constraint. But you'll notice that when we, well, hello. You'll notice that when we do that, the rig explodes aggressively. Yes, what, okay, okay. I don't know why that happened. I'm just going to delete the constraint. Oh, okay. Also, probably would be a good idea to center the pivot of that. Perhaps that was the issue. Sometimes also, I don't know why constraint, well, that's not better at all. Oh, that's, okay. Every once in a while, when you set up constraints, for some reason they just sort of don't work, and you can just delete them and re-add them. But you'll notice with this, so like if I move the wrist, this one is now sort of following the wrist, but it's also like lightly attached to this this elbow joint here, so it kind of like follows in between them, if that makes sense. And you'll notice like if we look at this parent constraint, it actually has weights for both the wrist and the elbow. So like if I set the elbow to 0, it's going to snap over and follow the wrist completely. And you can even like scrub back and forth to sort of like decide where you want it between those 2 points. I'm just going to leave this as 1 and 1 for now and kind of call that a day. But what this enables us to do is then come through and be like, okay, like I want to, maybe shift this around a little bit. For some reason the rotate is not working super well. But that's like basically what we're going to do for most of these other controls. So in this case, they're like little groups of 2. I'm just going to sort of go through and group both of them together because like they can move at more or less the same time. That's fine. So again, grab the elbow and the shoulder, and then this new group, and do a parent constraint. And if we bent, okay, the joys of Maya. Okay. Modify center pivot. The centering of the pivot shouldn't actually do anything, but like, I don't know. Sometimes Maya's picky. So you can see it's kind of following along. It's like flopped the joints back and forth. So if for some reason that ever becomes an issue, the other thing you could potentially try is just making a new group for each of these and constraining them separately. So grab basically the shoulder and the elbow again, grab one of these groups. You can see it only has the one controller in it, to constrain, parent, and do the same thing again. And hopefully, if you were to bend the shoulder now, you can see, again, these sort of like follow along with both of those joints. And you're still able to go through and sort of modify them if you need to like shape that further or like maybe, do something else with it. So that's pretty much the basic setup of this. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. So one thing you might notice is like pretty much up to this point, we've been doing everything with the, like we've not actually attached any body parts to this at all. So what I'm going to do is just go in and figure out where the heck I put this cable. Haha. So we need a way for this cable, like if we, grab this and move it around, obviously we want the cable to follow it. So what we're going to do in this case is actually use a wire deformer to make that happen. So I'm going to grab if you go up into your deform menu, you'll notice there's like this little option for wire. Honestly, I just sort of make sure, like usually I'll just leave this as reset. Just make sure it has kind of the default values for it. And you'll notice that whenever I go to set this up, it is prompting you in the very, very bottom left, if you can see that. It says select the shape or shapes to deform and press enter. So I'm going to grab this cable, press enter, and then it's like select the wire curves or like the wire that you want to deform your object and press enter. So I'm gonna try to select that and just hit enter. And theoretically, your cable should now be attached to your skeleton. So you'll notice, like, if I move my wrist, this is actually a delightful stripy texture. I mean, it's moving a little bit, which is good, but obviously this is not looking correct. What you need to do usually, unless you've made your robot like super crazy tiny, is click on the mesh and go into this wire deformer and set the drop-off distance to something higher. If you ever have issues with this, you're moving your character around your scene and like the wire deformer is like set up really, really weird, you just go through and like set that to something crazy like 1,000,000. And that'll ensure that like pretty much wherever you move this this wrist, the wire is going to follow it. The other thing that is actually kind of cool that I like didn't realize was a thing, if you're like, I just realized like, oh crap, I made this cable freakishly wide for this holder, you can just take it and make it thinner. And it'll just sort of scale along that wire, which I just thought was kind of interesting. But yeah, so again, it's kind of janky and it's like honestly kind of convoluted and a pain, but it is a half decent way to get, you know, little cables or whatever that follow along with the body. And you can see like they deform fairly well. Maybe in this case I would want to grab this and like translate this down a little bit or something like that, but or like come over here and like I've put this in a kind of strange spot so I can, you know, kind of grab that and like push back into place. But this is like sort of how I would brute force set up rigging cables if I ever had to do that, which for this character I do. But yeah, I mean, it gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of like how you actually want to control this cable. That was sort of my weird like extra bonus rig thing. I'll probably make another video about this, but any questions on this or like how any of this stuff is sort of like interacting with each other or working? Okay. Let me just double check really quick. I think that was actually the last thing that I had for you guys. Yes, delightful. Okay. All right, so let's take a break, do like a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll do like half an hour of Open Lab where you'll have to like actually stay for Open Lab, and then if you want to run away, you can, and I can run around and sort of like help people with rig stuff. I do still have all of those videos if you guys want to take a look at those, like how to set up joint chains and all that good stuff, and I can sort of like make sure you guys are on the right track. But see you in 5 minutes. Or something. Words.